Okay, in this module 1 part 2 we're going to look at the anthropological perspective, just to give you some sort of grounding, some sort of foundation for the discussion of ethnomedicine that we're going to be engaged in. Let's start with the notion of cultural absolutism. Cultural absolutism is the idea that there is one standard, proper way of doing things, and other ways of doing things just don't measure up. In other words, it assumes that there is one culture that serves as a standard by which others are to be judged. It's not too difficult to understand why, let's say, the Europeans of the 19th century embraced cultural absolutism. Actually, many people today still do. So what was going on back in the 19th century? Well, at that point, there had been very little meaningful contact with people around the world. Basically, all Europeans knew about other peoples was what was reported by missionaries, explorers, and so forth. There was really no methodical, thoughtful ethnography being done. Ethnography is a writing or a written work about another culture. So there's not much of that being done. And it was quite easy for them to see themselves as the standard, since they had very little knowledge of what else was going on around the world, other than smattered accounts here and there of these really strange and odd people. And so it was assumed that Europe was the pinnacle of civilization and that they were the pure biological type, so the highest form of biological humans. And from that they assumed that they were the most intelligent, their society was the most advanced, and so forth. In fact, there were all sorts of racial schemes, usually typologized along the lines of color, with, of course, white being the standard at the very top. But this idea became more and more difficult to accept once people began to meaningfully interact with other people around the world. So where at one point in time it was assumed that people were speaking gibberish and worshiping trees and rocks and were basically children culturally, later people began to seriously question that point of view. In fact, it was eventually discovered that these indigenous tribal peoples of Africa, Asia, and the New World all spoke very, very complex languages, practiced very sophisticated religions, and generally speaking, it was eventually determined that the term primitive, if anything, could only be applied perhaps to their material culture that has to do with tools, clothing, shelter, things of that nature, their technological sophistication. In that regard, you can say that there are some people that are relatively simple compared to others, but that's about it. Once we began to move away from cultural absolutism and field work became very popular, that was around the year 1900 or so, we slowly began a transition towards cultural relativism. When I say we, of course, I'm talking about anthropology, sociology, the scholars who are doing the studies and so forth. They began to move towards a position called cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the opposite of cultural absolutism. Cultural relativism basically says that all cultures should be assessed and evaluated and examined on their own merits. In other words, no culture is assumed to be the standard by which others are to be judged. All cultures, it was realized, are functional. They all work. There are, after all, 10,500 different religions in the world today, and people everywhere are basically happy with their religion. Their religion is functional within their culture. So there was this sort of general idea of functionalism that replaced the notion of absolutism. And that's pretty much where we stand today. Of course, cultural relativism leads naturally to pluralism. Pluralism is the idea that, for example, when you apply it to religions, there are 10,500 different religions in the world. They all seem to be functional within their cultural context. It works for the societies in which they're practiced. And so therefore, how can we actually normatively judge the superiority or inferiority of one religion versus another? Because after all, when you're talking about religion and the truth claims of religions, you're talking about claims that are generally non-falsifiable, which means it just can't be tested. It doesn't mean they're true or false, it just means they can't be tested. So they sort of hang out there in this ether of uncertainty. And so that's pretty much where the study of religion, for example, in anthropology stands today. It's done in a sort of cultural relativistic, pluralistic, almost agnostic way. Agnostic has to do with pretty much suspending belief in a kind of way. So anthropologists tend not to become too vested in the cultures they're studying. It's assumed that they're all functional to some extent, and the task of anthropology is to discover precisely how they're functional. There are three primary observations that have been made by anthropologists, and these will all tie in with some of the comments that have been made thus far, but three important, significant observations that guide our thinking regarding cultural behavior cross-culturally. The first is this: the level of technological development of a particular group is not indicative of their intellectual capacity. So in other words, when we see a group that's practicing simple horticulture, they have their little digging sticks and they're planting yams, they hunt with bows and arrows that they make. I'm referring, for example, to a group like the Yanomamo in South America. Well, yes, we can certainly say that they have a simple technology, but in regard to everything else, their religion, their social structure, their language, and so forth, they are just as sophisticated and quote-unquote evolved culturally as everyone else. In fact, it didn't take long after we began to do serious field work that it became quite clear that all humans around the world belong to the genus and species Homo sapiens. Everyone from the Mbuti Pygmies of North Central Africa to the Australian Aborigines to Scandinavians to whatever. We're all members of the genus and species Homo sapiens. We're all 99.9% genetically identical. Second important observation: the various components of culture, for example, language, religion, diet, family structure, etc., are not absolute. So the point being here is that there are no absolute ways of doing things culturally. There are a variety of family structures, a variety of marriage types, a variety of diets, lots of languages, tons of religions, all of which make it next to impossible to claim absolutism for any one of them. And that is primarily, once again, because these cultural phenomena are all functional. In other words, generally speaking, they all work within their cultural context. So it's sort of nonsensical to assume that they could be either good or bad in some sort of way. As long as they're functional, they're quote-unquote good, as far as anthropologists are concerned. Of course, one of the primary issues here, and some people say the main issue, the main concern of people around the world, is simply biological survival. Production has to do with how we feed ourselves, our subsistence patterns, etc. And reproduction, of course, has to do with procreation and the perpetuation of the species. And these really, many anthropologists point out, are our primary concerns. Everything else is just sort of window dressing. That basic approach, by the way, is referred to as cultural materialism, the idea that material factors are the primary influences on cultural behavior. One way to think about this idea of cultural absolutism and the fact that we should not assume that our way of life, in fact, is somehow absolutely correct, is to consider the Battle of Tours. The Battle of Tours occurred in 732 CE, just inside the border of France, north of Spain. And Islam was steadily making its way up into the European mainland. Of course, it had spread from Saudi Arabia, went across North Africa, crossed up into Spain, and was moving into Central Europe when they were met by an army, a Christian army, led by Charles Martel in 732, and defeated, turned back. And that effectively halted the expansion of Islam into Europe. Eventually, Islam would even be pushed off of the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain, leaving Europe totally Christian. Well, that's important because the people that colonized this part of the world were all Christians. And there's no mystery why Christianity is the dominant religion in this country. It's simply because the people that colonized us were Christians. This raises an interesting question. What if Islam had prevailed in the Battle of Tours? What if Europe had become Muslim? Well, as you can see, everything would have changed. Perhaps there would not have been New World colonization. Perhaps Africans would not have been transported to the New World. Everything about history would have changed. So culture is somewhat influenced by historical accident. One other example is language. There are some who assume that there is, for example, an absolutely proper form of English, but what they fail to realize is that this quote-unquote proper form of English, whatever they conceive it to be, would be almost totally non-functional in certain social contexts. And so anthropologists tend to look at language pragmatically. What form of language, what form of speech works in a given context? That's how we evaluate language. Thus, all forms of English are proper in their given context. So again, we see the problem with assuming absolutism. There are other examples that could be given, but I think these will suffice to make the point that these various cultural phenomena, language, diet, religion, family structure, marriage, are not absolute. They're very much functional and fine-tuned to the cultural context in which they're practiced. And then finally, our last observation. Culture is passed down from one generation to the next by means of instruction and learning, not biological inheritance. So culture is a learned phenomenon. We learn to crave a certain diet. We learn to worship a certain way. We become partial to our own culture as a result of a long period of enculturation, the process whereby a person is taught their culture. After all, if there were twins born in Paris, Texas, for example, you could separate the newborns the day they're born and ship one off to Paris, France, and in 25 years, in one case, you would have a Texan through and through, namely the child that was reared in Paris, Texas, and this person would, of course, be like all other Texans culturally. Yet on the other hand, his counterpart, raised in Paris, France, would be French culturally, through and through. We quite easily adapt to the cultural environment in which we're raised. Of course, eventually we begin to see our own culture as somehow, quote-unquote, the way things are superior to other cultures. But that's just a mistake that has to do with the fact that we have no basis of comparison unless, of course, later in life we educate ourselves regarding the world. We do some traveling, do some reading, etc. So I think that there's a few things that we can take from this. Number one, racism is a terribly flawed ideology, since racism assumes that an individual's phenotype somehow determines their behavioral characteristics. And of course we know that that is blatantly false, given the knowledge of biology and genetics today. It's a person's learning and training that influences their behavior, not their genetics.